Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the deep woods for a collection of scary stories. I also have the pleasure of being joined by fellow horror narrator Jnightmares, who translates and narrates exclusive stories from Japanese that you would never have heard anywhere before. Feel free to check him out by following the link in the description and at the end of the video. But for now it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlights and let the darkness take control. We used to catch fish in my grandparents' cabin near the Canadian border, and we would have a dumping ground for the guts of the fish we caught. This was probably 250 yards into the woods, far away from the cabin so we wouldn't attract bears or other scavengers near our place where we were staying. I was 11 years old and was tasked with dumping the guts. It was dusk and I headed into the woods when I took a wrong turn and realized this and headed back to the main trail, when all of a sudden it was getting dark. I didn't have a flashlight or phone on me, so I kept walking down the trail, and I find the dumping ground. So here I am, it's almost pitch black except for the moon, and I smell rotting fish guts when I hear a large animal probably 20 feet away from me in the woods. I slowly walk down the trail, and when I get on the main road, I book it back to my cabin. The next day we find cougar tracks at the fish dumping ground. To this day, I'm terrified of the woods at night. It was a seriously traumatic experience.
This is a true and mysterious event which happened to me and some friends one summer night a few years ago. Every summer, a couple of old school best friends and I get together and we go on a little trip together. On the year this occurred, we had all decided on renting a cottage in the woods. It was going to be great. We were going to have a barbecue and a campfire. It was the usual crew, me and two friends. We're all females, by the way. My friend drove, and it took us hours to get there. It was already evening by the time we got to the cottage, and we were all hungry. We had prepared for this, though. We brought all our barbecue gear, and we were ready to have a feast. We had a great night, chatting and reminiscing by the log fire, and of course, eating way too much. Even though it was summer, the sun had already set by about 8 p.m. So that was our call to head back into the cottage. It was a real shame though. I suddenly had the urge to go to a hot spring. I know this sounds a little odd, but it's called an onsen in Japanese, and we love going to them in summer. I mentioned it to my friends, and everyone was on board. We got fired up, since we were all tired and full. Well, the cottage didn't have a hot spring, so we hit a dead end. Not wanting to slow down or waste the trip, I got my phone out and started Googling to see if there were any springs nearby, and we were in luck. There was one only a short drive away. We quickly packed some of our clothes and jumped back in the car. Since we weren't familiar with the area, we were completely dependent on the car navigation system. The narrow roads were so dark since the forest was all around us. I didn't want to get lost out here. I was starting to lose faith in my idea. But then we turned onto the highway. The mood lifted in the car, and we were back to chatting and laughing. Right. The car navigation system interrupted. It was just the one word. I noticed this because the sat-nav system said, "After 100 meters, turn right." I thought it was odd, but I didn't care that much. Another odd thing was that it asked us to turn while we were in a curve in the road. We turned back a little, and at the exact same point in the road, the satellite navigation system said, "Right." These country roads were very narrow. We didn't see the dirt road the first time, but spotted it when we doubled back. We obeyed the sat-nav and turned down the dirt road. The laughter and sense of excitement in the car ebbed away and was replaced by a sense of anxiety. This road, it didn't seem like it was leading us to the hot springs. The forest road just got steeper and steeper and darker. I felt as if we were moving further from the town and from people. I started to doubt the existence of the hot springs. We ceased talking at this point. The air in the car was thick with tension. I wanted to turn back, but I knew that we couldn't. The The road was only just wide enough for our car. There was no way we could do a U-turn. I started to worry. What might happen if an oncoming car came at us at full speed? Since we didn't know where we were, we decided that we would stop the car and check out our surroundings. I was amazed to discover that we were nearing a cliff edge. I had no idea that we had driven this high up into the mountains. I was lost for words, and so were my friends. Fear now had a grip on us. Forget the hot springs, we just needed to get back. Get back to somewhere familiar. No one said a word, and I'm glad they didn't because I was just panicking. We just stared at one another's faces in the dark and wondered what to do. We had no choice but to keep going forward, because the road was simply not wide enough to turn back. I knew deep down that we were moving further and further from the town, from the people, and from the lights. Just as our anxiety reached its peak, my friend spotted something up in the road ahead. The road widened ahead. Relieved, we sped towards it to perform the U-turn that would get us out of the mountainous woods. Then, the car's headlights illuminated a building. A building almost crumbled to ruins. A derelict and frightening-looking place. And in that moment we laid eyes on it, we heard, "You have arrived at your destination." Then, the power in the car went out. We were plunged into darkness. We panicked, but it came back on instantaneously. We turned the car around and headed back to the safety of the cottage. There was no hot spring. There was no way that creepy building in the woods could have ever been a hot spring either. I cannot forget that event. And we often talk about it when we meet up. Perhaps we were summoned or called by something in that abandoned building.
I was around 19 and had gone camping with two of my buddies in Central Oregon. Very remote type of place, taking hours of driving just to get to the trailhead. It was a 3-day backpacking excursion, or at least that is what we had intended. We were young and inexperienced and wound up getting lost on the second day. It took us 4 days to find our way out of the dense growth. Incidentally, we stumbled into a deserted mining town by accident, which gave us our bearings. We rationed our provisions, so we were far from a dire predicament in this regard. And it was mid-August, so the elements did not impact us too adversely. So far, nothing creepy about it, but when that happened in the 4th night of our trip is something that will not escape me soon. By this point, we were growing pretty concerned at our situation, as the entire day had been spent trying to find our way out of the woods. We had settled into a camp for the night, wary and anxious. Our fire was dying out, so we threw in a few more hunks of wood and climbed into our tents in the hopes of catching some much-needed sleep. I can't be sure who woke up first, but it was either me or one of my friends. I can't describe exactly what woke us, but what we heard next was something that sounded like a telegraph or perhaps an old typewriter. It was faint but with an unmistakably clear cadence of seemingly random clicks and taps. I poked my head out of the booth to find both of my friends wide-eyed, staring. We were definitely all hearing it, but no one said a word. The fire was smouldering and ashing, and the sky was overcast so we couldn't see beyond our tents. The sound was faint and hard to pinpoint, but in my mind, I kept trying to rationalize the sound being a squirrel or a woodpecker. Before any of us had a chance to say anything, a new sound could be heard. It was distinctly more faint, but undeniably not an unnatural sound that you would hear in the middle of the woods dozens of miles away from the nearest town. When we heard it, the noise that sounded like the transmission you hear between NASA flight control and astronauts in outer space, overlaid with music that sounded like orchestra. A high-pitched beeping sound, music, static, silence, unintelligible words being spoken by a male voice, more static, high-pitched beeps, silence, music, static. The beep had a resonating echo. The static would go on for a minute at a time, broken by bouts of short silence. We were lost in it. The air was a thick damp, and I could feel the gravelly sound scraping against my senses. I recall my hand was trembling when I looked down. The whole ordeal lasted maybe half hour, but in a court of law I'd swear it was hours. None of us rested the rest of the night. We wandered aimlessly around the next day, tired and dazzled, growing increasingly terrified of the darkness that approached. Neither of us spoke of the incident after the trip. We never made any pact or anything corny, we just ignored it. And before anyone asks, we weren't high or tripping anything. We hadn't even packed any alcohol. We were completely sober. I'm 28 now and have lost touch with my two buddies from that trip, though I thought I found one of them was a KIA in Iraq last year. I still have dreams about that night, because they aren't necessarily as horrifying as they are incredibly rare.
I went fishing with my friend just outside of Tokyo, by an area close to the Shiro-maru Dam. It's a little tricky to get to the fishing spot, or even find it. It's really a spot only the locals know about. We arrived at night, and the plan was to fish until the sun rose. We were going to catch as much as possible. But once we set up all the gear, I didn't much feel like going hell for leather all night. I just wanted to relax, so I set up my rod with a bite alarm, and I just chatted with my friend. I got a bite. I raced to my feet and snatched up the rod, expecting a battle with a big fish. I was surprised to feel no pull. Was the line entwined in the weeds, or did a fish get lucky and make off with my bait? I wondered as I began to reel the line in. It felt like something very delicate was on the line or was attached to it. It didn't seem like it was in the weeds. I reeled in the line for another 30 centimeters or so, and I got the shock of my life. There was a large amount of human hair attached to the line. I looked over at my friend who was watching me, and his face was frozen in a silent scream. I instinctively threw the rod to the ground. I didn't want to lose my expensive fishing rod, and it was being pulled into the water, so I just cut the line and watched it disappear into the murky deep. It was still long before dawn, and my friend and I didn't feel like fishing anymore with that down there. We decided to get the hell out of there. On the way home, we were discussing what had happened with the rod in the car, and before we knew it, we were sharing scary stories that we heard of or we read. This actually helped to get rid of some of the tension in the car that we shared. We were now thinking of the hair on the rod as a story rather than something disturbing. I mean, of course, I was still going to go home and report it, but I couldn't really do anything until we got home. We were still out in the woods. I was telling a scary story I had heard, which I thought was a really good one, and when I got to the punchline or the payoff, I was surprised because my friend didn't react, and he hadn't said a word. "Hey, I'm driving here and you're sleeping. At least you can do is listen to my story, man. I'm tired too." I was mad at him, so I looked over at him, and I was annoyed to see that he was still awake. But then I looked at his face, and his face was really pale. He was staring out of the passenger window. "What the hell is up with you, man? You're freaking me out." "Is this a prank?" I asked. "There's a woman out there. She's standing on the side of the road," he replied. We were still surrounded by the woods either side of the dark roads. "What's she doing out here this time of night? Where is she?" I asked. "She's always there. No matter where we go, man. She's just standing by the side of the road watching us," he mumbled. "What are you talking about?" "At first I thought I was crazy, but I've seen her 7 times now," he said. I still held out hope that he was pranking me, so I kept an eye on his side of the road. My spine froze when I saw a woman stood by the road up ahead. The car was fast approaching her, and just as my friend said, she was stood there, staring at us. I looked at my friend and he just silently nodded at me. We drove for miles in silence back to town, and I saw her again and again. I don't know how many times, maybe 20. I dropped my friend back at his house. I watched him in the rearview mirror, and he looked really nervous and timid. I got back to my house, dumped the fishing gear inside, and locked the doors as fast as I could. I went upstairs, and I was too scared to take a shower. I just got into bed. When I got downstairs in the morning, I saw my mum, and she was looking concerned. "Can you explain what the hell that is in your cooler?" she asked in a stern voice. "I didn't catch anything, I don't think. I don't know. Why?" I said. "You brought back something weird. Go see for yourself. You better deal with that, because I'm not touching it." I walked over to the cooler and saw the fishing line I had cut. That dirty line, entwined with that jet black hair. That line that I thought sank was staring at me in my home. I have no idea how it got there, and I'm almost certain my friend didn't prank me. It's a mystery. It scared the hell out of me.
I grew up in a really rural town. It took 15 minutes of driving to get to any sort of establishment. One night when I was around 8 or 9, my friend and I were standing outside in the driveway, waiting for my father to come outside to bring her home. All of a sudden, we hear this rustling around the bushes. Now, it would be strange for a deer to come that close to a few kids fooling around, but we couldn't see what it was, and our first reaction was to figure it must be an animal. It was just an animal until we hear a deep, rough voice go, "Hey." We ran into the house, screaming, and as we got to the door, there was something in our bushes. My father came to investigate, and I was still shaking in my boots. When a drunk man comes wandering out of the bushes, he said he heard us talking, so he thought we could help him. But I'm still confused as to how he managed to get into the bushes in the first place. I was looking at the road that was about half a mile long, and we sent him on his way. And from then on, it was easy to make me jump out of fright when I was alone in the driveway at night.
I had a bad experience the last time I went hiking in the mountains. It happened a long time ago, back when I used to love climbing mountains. I would prefer to stay anon, since my name is attached to a few hiking societies. And I don't know if some of my friends would laugh at me for this. I remember that it rained on the way down the mountain, and I didn't bring any rain-resistant clothing with me. It was a classic mistake. I found a little spot beneath an outcropped bit of cliff, which offered some shelter, so I stopped there and thought I'd wait until the rain passed. It would be way too dangerous to climb down from the height I was at. It was really coming down, which would make it difficult to climb back to the base. I thought it wouldn't keep raining like this for too long, an hour at max. But contrary to my expectations, the rain continued and a fog bank rolled in. I'll be spending the night here at this rate, I thought to myself. The sun had already set at this point, and the night was approaching. I could see nothing but mountains and trees ahead of me. I didn't like to be stuck out here at night, so ill-prepared. I sat on my fold-out chair, turned my radio on, and had a snack. I looked up and noticed that someone passed by. It was about 10 o'clock at night at this point. "Hey, the path down is really dangerous," I called out. She nodded, slightly, and stopped. She looked to be about 20 years old. It was weird that she was out here wandering around so late. I tried to speak to her, and this is how the conversation went, to the best of my recollection. "Do you even have a torch?" No response. "It's too dangerous to try and climb down right now, you know?" No response. "We should wait until the rain stops, or until it gets brighter at least." She nodded her head slightly. It wasn't as if she came out here in high heels or something. She looked more prepared than I was. What I'm getting at is, she wasn't a damsel in distress. I guessed that she knew what she was doing. Since the conversation wasn't flowing, I looked her up and down, and then asked, "Are you here alone?" She shook her head to indicate no. "Well, where are the others then?" I asked. "There was a landslide up there." Finally an answer. "Was anyone up there hurt?" I asked. This was beginning to worry me now. Even though I wasn't drunk, it was as if I was suddenly sober. I can't explain that feeling in any other way. That was all I ever got out of her. She reverted back to silence after that. She left soon after, despite my protests. I didn't actually see her leave. I don't know, that part is kind of a blur in my mind. At first light, I headed back down the mountain, safe in the knowledge that the rain had subsided some hours ago. On my way down, I noticed a helicopter flying overhead, and then I passed by a search and rescue officer. I made it down the mountain, and I was absolutely starving, so I headed into the restaurant at the base. The customers in the restaurant were discussing what happened. The same thing that young woman told me. The landslide. Oh, that's terrible. I don't know if anyone made it back. Do you know? The news was on in the restaurant. After a moment or two, the newscaster spoke of the landslide. Turns out there was a university hike on the mountain, and the landslide got them all. The newscaster reported that there was no survivors. When the photos of the victims passed by on the screen, my heart froze in my chest, for one of the women in the photo was the very woman I had that one-way conversation with. I haven't been able to go back to the mountains since.
My friends and I used to hike a lot near my place. I live in a nice, quiet, well it was quiet then, neighborhood very close to a mountain. Over time we started exploring and eventually made our own path by clearing away plants and stuff. The path was kind of hidden. You had to go out of the trail, which wasn't frequented a lot. One day we were almost at the top of the mountain, which is a 4-hour hike, fooling around, and I took out my camera and started recording a video of my friend doing a stupid dance. We hiked uphill for another hour until we got to the end of the trail we made, and then went back down. We walked to my place and split. When I downloaded the photos and video to my computer, I noticed the unmistakable shape of a man crossing the trail about 20 meters from us. This is a hidden trail we made ourselves, and it takes 4 hours to get there. I'm pretty sure we were followed, and I still don't understand how we didn't notice. From that day on, we always took one of our friends' huge St. Bernards with us when we went hiking. Some other weird stuff happened there. We would hear strange noises, sounds like ooh, and at certain times of the day, it happened. We also found a grave. The name was Margarito Esperanza. Again, this was in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't even a trail there before we made one. We also found a creepy cave with a wooden door and iron fitting. The door looked hundreds of years old. The tiny cave was empty, but I never had the balls to go in there without a flashlight. I wish I'd have taken a picture of it. Unfortunately, that part of the mountain is now inaccessible due to urban development that happened in 2006 and 7.
A few years ago, I was searching for some part-time work with my friends. I found an interesting-looking job in a magazine. The advert read, "Day's work required. Manage my mountain lodge. No experience necessary." It seemed perfect, but the pay was even better. 20,000 yen. That's over $180, which is a lot to a kid in university. I called the number in the magazine straight away. Unfortunately, they told me that the position had been filled. I was really disappointed. The next week, I got the new edition of the same magazine, and I saw the job advertised again. I called straight away. I really wanted that job. I was offered an interview. I was so happy. The interview would take place in a restaurant across town. Okay, a little unorthodox, but I didn't mind. I was also asked if I had any friends who were looking for work. I said that I did, and I was asked to bring him along to the interview. When we met up, we were told by the interviewer that we would be paid the morning after our stay in the lodge. That pretty much seemed to be the interview. We were hired on the spot. I guess he liked the look of us. The location of the lodge was surprisingly close to the city. It was in a privately owned forest. We were handed maps. When we arrived, we walked as deep into the forest as we could, but our progress was halted by a chain-link fence. A rusty sign hung. It read, "No trespassing." We found our way to an entrance gate, and there we were greeted by an older man who asked, "Ah, you're X and Y, aren't you? Listen to my instructions and then follow me." We walked in a 3 all together for about 10 minutes. I imagined that we'd be working in some lovely rustic log cabin, but what I saw up ahead was a mass-manufactured metal shed. The only issue with the place was the fact that there was no shower or bath. That, and we had to bring our own food. We were warned of this beforehand, but still it was a little bit annoying. But I didn't let it ruin the good vibe though. We were in great spirits that day. We received our instructions. We were to water the plants outside at night and in the morning, and then perform light cleaning in the lodge. That was it. Since there was no TV in the building, we kept ourselves from boredom by playing card games and with our smartphones. There was no aircon either. At first we thought this would be hell, but since the shed was deep in the woods, it turned out to be surprisingly cool in there, despite it being made of metal. When night fell, we ate dinner, a banquet from the convenience store. The dinner of kings. We decided to get to sleep early, as there was little else we could do. We both jumped into separate beds. The metal frames creaked with every movement. The beds looked like those typical ones you would see in military films, army beds. That night, I had the most disturbing nightmare of my life. I could only recall it in dazed fragments. It went like this. As I slept in the bed, hands from beneath the floorboards reached up. Unrelenting, grasping arms. They grasped and tore at my body. They tore it to shreds, like in the zombie movies. I must have woken up screaming because my friend shouted out, "What's wrong?" I told him that I had a terrible nightmare. His face looked pale when I explained the nightmare, and he told me he had experienced the same thing. That was weird. We both were silent for a while, the early morning light creeping through the cracks of the metal shed. My friend broke the awkward silence after a while by saying, "I feel sick." It felt as if the floor was vibrating. I could understand why he felt sick. I felt a sickness only akin to seasickness. I thought it was just the aftermath of my dream. My friend got up and started peering down through the floorboards. He dropped to his knees and started to pull at one of the boards. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me that he wanted to see what was under the floor. "Come on, give me a hand," he called. I was curious. It was light out. It was around 5 a.m. Not really bright, but a little dim, enough to see there. He lifted a board back, and I shone the torch I had brought with me beneath the boards. My friend then shouted, Arms! I craned my neck round to see what he was screaming about. Beneath the floorboards were countless, pale, amputated arms. They looked as if they were cut with a machine-like precision. It was at this point I realized they were non-human arms. Mannequin arms. As if this wasn't disturbing enough, attached to each of the mannequin arms was a Polaroid of a woman. What I can only assume was the woman in the photo's name was written on each arm in magic marker. I swear that there were nearly 50 in total. I touched one of the arms. I had to check if it was human or not. I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't check. Hard plastic. My friend said, "Let's just wait outside until we get the money and then let's run and never look back." I like the sound of that plan, I said. We were waiting outside for another 2 hours when the same old man who had let us through the chain link fences returned. "Hello, boys. Thank you so much for your hard work. Incidentally, are you both interested in making some more money? 3 more nights for $550? "No thanks," my friend and I called as we took our pay from his hand. We moved quickly. We wanted nothing more to do with that shady organization, whatever the point of it was. I remember I looked back once. I caught the old man looking angrily towards us and pulling out his cell phone and putting it to his ear. I wanted to report this activity, but they hadn't really committed an offense, and when I tried to call the number again one night at a party after I told the story, There was a message stating that the number was no longer in service. The advert didn't appear in the magazine after that. I guess they got what they needed. Whatever that was.
I live out in a rural area. My bedroom has one of those sliding glass doors that's just a big sheet of glass with a frame. One night a few months back, I'm chilling in my room around midnight when I notice something outside through the corner of my eye. Now I see plenty of wildlife around the place, raccoons, foxes, squirrels, deer, skunks, and more. I'd seen a fox outside my door not long before, so figured it was a fox again. I saw the tip of a tail and started thinking of the fox. When I followed the body, it was too large to be a fox. Then I followed it to the head, and the head turned to look at me, and Christ, it was a mountain lion. I had to hold in the urge to piss myself and just turned and walked the hell off. I didn't want to deal with that.
My dumb friend invited me to go work with him at his part-time job. I was told it was going to be a ridiculously easy job. My friend, we'll call him N, I asked him about the gig, what kind of job it was. I didn't have a clue if I wanted to even do it or not. He told me that the job was just burning household goods. The strange thing was, we would burn these possessions, these things, in a remote part of the mountains. I jumped at the chance. I mean, if some guy offered to pay you just to burn some old junk, what would you do? There was an element of risk around the work though. It was a crime to have unauthorized fires out in the mountains, but the pay would more than make up for the risk. I was saving up for a motorbike at the time. I needed the money. I asked my friend what he did when he worked. He said that all he did was stand by the side of the road and check for passing cars. All he had to do was tell the guys burning the stuff when a car was approaching. The burners would temporarily try to cover the fire, to the best of their ability, hide, and then when the car passed, resume the burning. Sounded good to me. Shouting out when a car was approaching wasn't exactly backbreaking. The money made it worthwhile too. My friend N was a local. I wasn't. He seemed to know his way around though. We met at a factory, near the mountainous woods at midnight. I was told that it was better to work at night. There was less chance of being spotted. On country roads, like the one we were close to, only the occasional truck drove by. The other workers seemed like troubled kids and wannabe gangsters. Not the sort used to physical labor, I guess you could say. It wasn't the most professional outfit. There was a guy a little older than us delinquents who appeared to be some sort of foreman. Someone in charge. He wore glasses, was a slim guy, and always seemed to have an eye on the operations. He looked like he was part of the Yakuza. So there N and I were, in the mountains at night, with nothing but Yakuza, delinquents, and the chirp of crickets for company. A truck arrived. It was full of household items. Desks, shelves, chairs, and Japanese-style dolls. It looked like all this stuff didn't come from just one house. The foreman walked over and offered half the payment of the night's work up front when he saw the truck arrive. My friend N was loving this. He knew the area well, and he knew how to run into the woods and escape if we had to. If the cops came or something. As soon as I saw him grin, I knew we would both be fine. Some sheets of paper were handed out before we started to burn the stuff by the slender foreman in the glasses. He asked everyone to please read the list carefully. He handed out these sheets of paper. He even handed these sheets of paper out to the watchmen by the road. I can remember some of the items on the list. There were loads more there. Number 6, a black chest of drawers, 6 drawers. Number 7, a white uniform. Number 8, a 3-sided mirror with a mark on it. Number 9, a brown chest of drawers, 3 on top. I mean, this is just an example of the stuff we had to burn. "Remember the order, people, get to work," the foreman shouted. I didn't really understand. It was all going to get burned, so what was the point of the order? I didn't really care. We were going to get paid, so it didn't matter. I doused the first item in gas and lit it on fire. I chatted with the other guys who were hired. I guess we were all a bit bored. The foreman didn't seem that interested at first. He looked as if he had time to kill. He was playing around with his phone. Then he wandered over to me and Anne and struck up a conversation. He asked us things like, "What will you use the money for?" General chit-chat. Of course, I wasn't dumb enough to let too many personal details slip. I kept my answers as short as possible. N asked, "Hey, where did you get all this stuff?" Local shaman. Kind of priest," he replied. We now knew where all the stuff came from, but we didn't know what the big deal was about burning it, or the reason of the order on the list. After he told us this, he turned a bit cold, especially towards N, who asked him. We went back to work, and he wandered off. His attitude told us, no more questions. The flames grew higher and higher. The watchers by the side of the road grew wary and restless. They glanced our way while checking left and right. After a few minutes, one of the watchers shouted that a car was approaching. The guy with the glasses quickly asked if it was a police car, and said before we started the job that if it wasn't the police, the next worst thing would be a normal civilian car. Your run-of-the-mill family car. Truckers don't care if they see a fire. They have a job to do, and they can't stop to report stuff. But family cars were bad news, and one was approaching. We were told that the job would last until sunrise, but the passing car got the foreman a bit freaked out. He wanted us to speed the job up. There was still work to do, but the foreman told us to just hurry up and burn all the stuff before the cops turned up. We nervously looked at one another while the foreman paced around. His cell phone rang, and he answered. It was so quiet that night, I almost could hear the voice of the man he was speaking to. He started to apologize to whomever he was speaking to. He said that we were burning it all according to the instructions. He said that there were no problems and everything was going to plan. The job would be done. Tonight. He turned to us and said, "Keep burning, guys. We need this done tonight. We don't have much time." We were getting to the last few artifacts, 2 chests of drawers and a small doll. The foreman was getting annoyed with the order, and he repeatedly said that he didn't see the harm in lining them all up and just burning them all at once. "Just douse all of it and let's get going before we're all arrested." Change of plans, it seemed. It didn't bother us, we still got paid. Might as well earn the money, I thought. Just as I was dousing the last few items in gasoline, the foreman approached. He was on the phone, explaining to the other party how he hadn't changed the plan. He kept saying, "No, we haven't skipped anything. I promise we're doing it, as the list dictates, sir." He put his hand over the phone and shouted at me and N. "Just burn it all. Ignore the list. Don't worry." He went back to apologizing over and over again. The doll and the chests of drawers were ablaze. The doll burned. It made a horrible squeaking sound which pierced the silent mountain night. It looked as if it sat upright. My friend N is absolutely convinced that the doll reacted to the heat in a physical way, as if it could feel it, but I think it was simply the plastic reacting to the heat of the fire which made it look as if it moved. Either way, it was disturbing, especially in the dead of night, in the woods. We all stood there transfixed on the items burning. I couldn't take my eyes off of the doll. I saw its right arm raise up. Next was something unexplainable. The doll appeared to point towards the foreman, the guy who had been on the phone the whole time. He was so focused on his conversation, he didn't notice it. I started to freak out about the order and the rules around all this burning stuff. I began to believe that it had all meant something. The atmosphere was very sober. We did it right, though. I'm sure we did it right. I considered this as I watched the doll's fingers turn black and melt, all the while still pointing at the foreman. I glanced over to N and a couple of the other workers. They were all watching too. When everything had been sufficiently burned, we were handed a fire extinguisher each and were told to put the fire out. This was strange to me. It felt like the work was still half done. I didn't mind it that much though. Extinguishing the fire meant the conclusion of the job, and that wasn't bad at all. We burners and the watchers began to chat a bit. It felt like the night was almost over. It wasn't so stressful now. The foreman finished his call and walked back to us, all in a group, by the fire. No one said a word about the doll. I started to doubt what I had seen. Then we were handed the remaining cash that we were owed. This was a bit more like it. I couldn't wait to get back to civilization, and that was the end of the night, and that was the end of the job. A month or so went by. and I bumped into N. He walked over to me with a friend of his I hadn't met before. He said it was the guy who introduced him to that line of work. We spoke about that job. He then asked, "Hey, you remember the foreman-looking guy, the one with the glasses, who was on the phone the whole time?" Yeah, I remembered. Yeah, he died. They said that his death was a suspicious one. N continued to work these weird burn and lookout jobs. He said that one late night the guy didn't turn up for work. He wouldn't answer the phone no matter how many times he was called either. People went to check on him. They said that something weird had happened in his apartment. There was a smell coming from there. They got the janitor to check on him. When they approached the door, they soon realized the source of the smell. The janitor opened the door with his master key. The stench was unbearable. The smell of fire, the stench of something burned, flooded their noses. Their faces told a story, as they knew they were too late. The man was burnt to a crisp in his bed. His body was charred and blackened. He didn't look as if he had moved at all, they said. He looked peaceful, as if he hadn't rolled around to extinguish the flames. The police concluded that he had died from smoking in the bed. I didn't know that he was a smoker. I didn't see him smoke once that night we worked together. It was disturbing to hear that someone I had known, if only briefly, was no longer walking the earth. The most disturbing part came next. N said that he didn't think the foreman died from smoking in the bed. He just turned to me and said, "This is why you don't mess around with the order the shaman gives you. He didn't follow the instructions on the list. Maybe it's all a coincidence, but it scared the hell out of me." This happened recently, and I don't really have an explanation for this. I find it pretty mysterious. I love to go hiking in the mountains and in the woods. This happened on a day in mid-August during the Obon festival in Gifu Prefecture. I was heading to Nagano, which is the neighboring prefecture to Gifu, to stay overnight, but I guess I got lost along the way. If you look at the map, you'll see the area between the two prefectures is deep in the mountains. I needed to pull over and check the map properly, but since I was on a mountain road, in the woods, I wanted to pick the right spot. I looked at the Maps app on my phone, and it turned out I was on the right road the whole time, so I used the opportunity to take a break from driving and have a drink. I realized that the place I had parked in was pretty amazing looking. It had a nice view, lots of scenery. I looked around and noticed something. I parked my car on the shoulder of the mountain road. I was opposite a cedar forest. It looked like one that had been man-made. You know, like the trees seemed as if they had been intentionally planted in patterns. It was probably a great place to take a walk. Deeper into the forest, I could make out a man-made structure. I thought that it could be a shrine. We get lots of shrines in Japan, and personally I find them pretty interesting, so I decided to get out and stretch my legs and take a look at it. I often did this on long drives. Even though I said it was a mountain, it wasn't a particularly steep one. It took me no time to get to the shrine in the forest. Forests are easier to walk through than rocky mountain passes, is what I'm trying to say here. I came to a small clearing in the forest, and as I approached the area the shrine was, I thought, whoa, this isn't maintained too often. Looks a little too small to be called a shrine too. It was practically dilapidated. No one else was around, so I decided to reach into my rucksack and grab a camera to take a photo. As I was doing this, I had the sudden impulse to look straight ahead. I looked up and I saw something weird. There were loads of cedar trees around, but ahead, a few tens of meters away, I could see something hiding behind a tree. It was white. All of a sudden, it was as if I couldn't move, like sleep paralysis had struck me. I couldn't avert my gaze. I was just staring at this white thing hiding behind a tree. It couldn't always conceal itself. I could see something white, like cloth, fluttering at the base of the tree trunk. This state of paralysis lasted for about 20 seconds, and then I was able to move. As soon as I was freed from the binds of that strange state of sleep paralysis, I felt my whole body shudder with chills, the like of which I've never experienced. I threw my rucksack back over my back, and I ran as fast as I could back in the direction of my car. Something was terribly wrong out there in those woods. The sun was setting now. I wondered if I had been there longer than 20 seconds. I just couldn't remember it. It was very disturbing. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, which meant that I tripped over debris on the forest floor occasionally. My intuition was screaming at me to get out of there as quickly as possible, and stop for nothing. I had this sinking feeling in my gut, which told me, don't look behind you, no matter what. I clattered into my car and fumbled for my keys. I then got in and sped away. I needed to change direction, and while I was maneuvering my car, I felt like I saw that white shadow being once again. I started to panic, and I struggled to control my car, but I got away. I couldn't see any other cars in the area that day, on the nearby roads. I only noticed trucks when I got onto the main road. I gave up on my trip that night, and I just headed home. I couldn't shake that weird feeling that something was watching me, or was potentially after me. That's all I can say about that day. I have thought about it since though, and I have considered that I might have been hallucinating because all I could make out was a white shadow which fluttered. It was so weird. My interest in going into the mountains or the woods has diminished somewhat. But I had to go back and investigate that shrine or try to make sense of what happened. It was weighing too heavily on my mind. The problem is, there are a whole bunch of these abandoned, dilapidated, shrine-looking buildings in that area, and I cannot identify which one I approached.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Huge thank you to Jnightmares for following me in this. Huge thank you to Jnightmares for doing this video with me. Thank you so much. I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and as always, a huge thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you enjoyed Jnightmares' work, you can check out a link to his channel on screen now and in the description. Don't forget that we have an app that's pretty cool and useful to download if you are so inclined. But I think I'd best leave it there. Check out Jnightmares following the links on screen now, and I'll see you in the next one.